Hello, and thank you for joining us for an MLive conversation about the one-year anniversary of the January 6th riot in Washington, D.C. My name is Malachi Barrett. I'm a political reporter for MLive, who's covered some past elections. And with me here is a research professor at the University of Michigan Center for Political Studies, Michael Traugott. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Malachi.
So tell us a little bit about your experience, and I understand that you study mass media and politics, elections, campaigns. So just give our listeners a little bit of a view of your expertise here.
Well, I'm a political scientist by training. I study mostly American campaigns and elections. I am interested in public opinion research, and I have a particular interest in how news organizations use polls to make news.
Interesting. That question itself, I feel like polling has become, a little shaky these days. So some polls that we have seen actually in the last week, I'm curious to get your opinion on, are about public perception around the January 6th event and whether the election was stolen. And, essentially to boil it all down, what we've seen is a pretty large contingent of Republicans, in some cases more than half, in some cases just a little bit under the majority, believe that Biden is an illegitimate president, the election was stolen, and seem to have some, validity to these election fraud claims, which have largely been unproven or not been able to be backed up there. So a year since the January 6th attack and a year and some change since the election itself was certified, explain what's going on there in terms of public perception. Why are we seeing such a large number of Republicans not believe the results, basically?
Well, I would say, by way of background, for about 2 decades, we have been in a period of increasing political polarization in the United States. It began with growing differences and attitudes about policy that Democrats and Republicans held. But it has descended into a kind of tribalism in which a large proportion of Democrats don't like Republicans and a large proportion of Republicans don't like Democrats. This has been accompanied by a declining trust in a lot of American institutions. And Donald Trump took advantage of this growing distrust and this trend in polarization in light of what the polls suggested was his expected loss in the 2020 election. And he began to create what's now known as the big lie about fraud in the administration of the election and in the counting of the ballots. I think partially to preempt the loss that he was facing, but also I think he saw a money-raising opportunity, and he also wanted to maintain control of the Republican Party as a way to keep his options open for 2024. So that's really underlying, I think, the events of January 6th, the planning that went into it, the organization, the funding of it. It's I think could be easily described as a way for him to maintain visibility and also control of the Republican Party.
There's a lot to get into there. I want to first ask you a little bit about your kind of takeaways from the president's speech today. He addressed the nation just after 9 a.m. and was pretty clear about describing January 6th as an attack on the country and our democratic institutions. But he also didn't invoke Donald Trump by name and kind of just referred to him as the former president. What do you make of that kind of strategy in talking about this event? And, what are some other takeaways from what the president had to say today?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's important to remember that there's a kind of a club of former presidents. They convene periodically for events that are, ceremonially important or sometimes have political consequences. Donald Trump has never been granted admission to that club. And it's not necessary to cite all of the instances in which he was uninvited or disinvited. But they've always, as part of this clubbiness, been very sociable towards each other and haven't spoken out against each other. So the first thing about the speech this morning was the way in which Joe Biden felt compelled to take on the big lie without mentioning, as you said, Donald Trump's name, because he felt it was important, I infer, for the sake of preserving democracy, to make it clear what happened and what didn't happen and what the consequences of it are and could be in the future for the nature of our democracy. Used Donald Trump's name because he didn't want to generate any particular quotations that could be used by the Republicans. But on the other hand, he made his arguments quite forcefully, and it was clear the things to which he was referring.
There, has been, I think, some carefulness around assigning blame for this event. Obviously, the president himself was charged with inciting an insurrection by Congress, and was cleared those charges by the Senate. But since then, I think there's been some hesitancy to, apply this event to Republicans as a whole. At the same time, there's been an effort to kind of downplay what happened, and there have been narratives about left-wing activists being involved, the FBI being involved, and things like that. Why is there still this disagreement on how we should view this event, how we should characterize it, the words we should use to describe it? There's disagreement on whether to call it a riot or an insurrection or, a coup and things like that. And I think all of those have a political lens, obviously, as well. But there seems to be some fundamental disagreement on how to characterize these events. And I think a year afterward, as we're starting to kind of write the history books on this stuff, how do you think it should be remembered and will be remembered?
Well, let me begin again by talking about the background to this, which is that for some time, States, and the fact that they have become a party predominantly of white supporters at a time when the demographics of the population are changing to the point where whites will become a minority in the population in the 2040s. So what has emerged is while the Democrats are a heterogeneous declining membership. So in the 2020 presidential convention, for example, the party didn't vote upon a platform to guide the Trump campaign. And Mitch McConnell has told the Republican National Committee that they shouldn't put out any unifying policy statement for the 2022 elections. So we have this divergence between the interests of the two parties in policy. And it's also important to remember that we don't really have national elections. We have a series of state and local elections held on the same day, but they are administered by state laws and regulations. So the Republicans have also attempted or in the process of getting their activists installed in these election administration positions, formally and informally, including poll watchers, to try to reduce access to the ballot in 2022, especially among minorities, and to influence the way the votes are going to get counted. So that is the real struggle that is underway. The Congress is trying to do something about nationalizing parts of American elections, but the Republicans have uniformly opposed this, especially in the Senate. So the prospects of national remedies for this are not very high, and we'll have to see how successful the Republicans are at the state and local level, looking towards 2022.
So officially, the Michigan Republican Party and the Republican Party at large has taken the position that Biden did win the election, whereas we're seeing signs that party officials within the party, people at the local level, the county parties that are spread throughout the state, and organizers are catering a bit more to folks who don't believe the election results. And there's been, multiple different attempts to institute election integrity reforms. And the Republican Party has kind of walked this line of, improving these systems. It's based on, what we know, mistakes and problems that are have long existed. Whereas there's a very vocal contingent of folks who think the election reforms are based on election fraud and these kinds of ideas of a widespread conspiracy to overturn the results, election machines being designed to be tampered with and things like that. So, tell me a little bit more about the ongoing efforts by Republicans to change voting laws and take more active roles in the administration of elections, and what that's really rooted in.
Well, one of the growing differences between the two parties is that, in general terms, the Democrats have been interested in increasing access to the ballot, while the Republicans have been interested in restricting access to the ballot, both eligibility to vote and the way votes are counted, under the guise of claims about fraud. Speaking as a political scientist, there is no evidence, demonstrable evidence, of any substantial fraud in the American electoral system. But this is a claim that Republicans make in order to justify some of the policies and laws that they want put in place. It's also important to remember that, especially for legislative seats, state house and state senate across the country, most of these districts have historically been gerrymandered to be quite safe for one party. So the significant election is the primary as opposed to the general election. And the endorsements of Donald Trump are potentially very important in these Republican primaries. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why Republican elected officials or Republicans who would like to run for office in a state legislative seat are adopting the big lie and refusing to look at the evidence about January 6th in a relatively objective way, because they don't want to alienate Donald Trump.
And Michigan has received a compared to the rest of the country, quite a few endorsements from the former president. I think the last count was around 14. He's said that Michigan needs a new legislature. There's been a lot of criticism on Republican lawmakers who either put together a Senate report, oversight report that didn't find any evidence of election fraud, or lawmakers who have resisted calls by the Trump base for another investigation of the results, what they're calling a forensic audit. Michigan's already done 250 some audits conducted by bipartisan clerks around the state. But obviously he's getting involved in these state races and is interested in installing conservatives who are, share his views, who are loyal to him, it appears. So, what does that say about his influence on the Republican Party? His ability to maybe get some of these people in office?
Well, Donald Trump's influence on the Republican Party is substantial. And in conjunction with the comment I made earlier about the lack of significant policy focus among Republican elites and elected officials, one of the reasons that some people refer to the Republican Party becoming cult-like is because it has become a party of an individual without a strong programmatic interest. I think if we go back to 2016 and the emergence of Donald Trump, it's important to remember that he has no prior elective experience, no prior experience in policy. He didn't have. There were some issues, mostly cultural issues, that he used to mobilize his supporters. But it is not a person that could be described as an expert in governance or a person who cares about good government. He's mostly been concerned with promoting his own interests. And I think that because he remains, at least publicly, undecided about 2024, he's leveraging that to maintain this influence he has over the party.
Democrats have been involved in it's a bipartisan investigation, but led mostly by Democrats in Congress, the January 6th committee, to look more at what happened, how it happened, forces behind it, who was involved, what was known ahead of time, and all of that. What are you seeing from public opinion there on another kind of extended investigation that's kind of centered around the former president? There were 2 impeachment trials. Now this could, it's a little bit different, but could be considered kind of a third prong of that effort. Is that, are people kind of tired of talking about this a year later, or, is that important to narrow down the facts of what happened here?
Well, I think this is a complicated issue in a number of domains. I wouldn't call the select committee bipartisan. It has 2 Republican members, but they were appointed by Nancy Pelosi. The initial proposal was to have an independent 9/11 commission, but the Republicans refused to support that. And so Speaker Pelosi went to this select committee mechanism instead. The work of the committee is very important for the sake of the historical record. There has to be a documentation of what happened, who was responsible, who helped to organize the activities, who paid for the activities. And I think that that's what the committee is trying to do. There is a very good chance, based upon historical data, that the Republican Party will capture the House in 2022. That is just a statement of the fact that the incumbent president's party historically loses a fair number of seats in the next midterm election, and the Democratic margin currently is, relatively slight. So, under the assumption that the Republicans take control of the House, the work of the committee will be killed. And so they have a kind of a deadline around the election or just after the election of 2022 to issue a report with this documentation. It's a massive enterprise. We don't really know yet whether they can make it or not, whether they can generate a report on that kind of schedule. But they have a very large staff, and they're working very hard to try to accomplish this. It's not so much about specific charges in the legal system or the work of the Department of Justice as it is assembling as much documentation as they can to include in the report and in support of the report.
Looking ahead to the 2022 elections, which are going to be fast approaching, we've got a lot of important races here in Michigan. All of our top statewide offices: governor, attorney general, secretary of state. We've got congressional seats up for grabs in these new districts that have been drawn, legislative seats up for grabs, judges as well. The Republican Party has brought in a lot of enthusiasm. It's seeing a lot of enthusiasm from the Trump base, from people kind of in the grassroots who are really motivated about election integrity issues. And that's being used as kind of a recruiting tool to get more people involved. They're putting together an election protection team for poll watchers, earlier than ever. But I'm kind of wondering what, if there's too much focus on the 2020 results, how that could maybe blunt some of the advantages that Republicans have coming into these midterm elections where, Biden's really unpopular. That will reflect poorly on Democrats down the ticket. I think, as you noted, this is expected to be a pretty good year for Republicans, but I'm hearing from people within the party who are kind of concerned that they could squander some of those advantages if they focus too much on an election that already happened, is out of their control. Is that a significant concern?
Well, I would say again, as general background, American elections recently have been less focused on issue divisions between the parties and more focused on organizational efforts to mobilize a base and to get them a ballot one way or another and, to get it cast. So the big lie is a very significant factor in mobilizing the Republican base. The survey data that you mentioned a moment ago show that a large proportion of Republicans, people who identify themselves as Republicans, think that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. And the Republican Party is going to use this to try to get them to the polls in November. The one thing that works against them potentially is that the quality, by standard criteria, the quality of candidates that the Republicans select, often with these endorsements from Donald Trump, would turn out to be relatively low quality candidates. That is, they don't have much campaign experience. They're not very issue focused. And so that could be the only negative factor for the Republicans, I think, in the 2022 elections.
The last thing I want to ask you about is just the symbolic value of this event. Internationally, America's seen as a bastion for democracy and kind of a guiding light for this form of a republic. And I think there's been some faith shaken when members of your own country try to overturn an election, and force members of Congress out of the Capitol building. what does this do to the long-term view of our democratic experiment here? And, what's kind of the future threat here, if there is one?
Well, I think the events of January 6th have created a lot of anxiety in the American public. Partly, it's the realization that our democracy is not really based upon a set of laws, but really on a set of assumptions commonly held. That we have elections that underpin our representative form of government, that the election system is fair, and that the votes are counted accurately, and that a central element of our democracy is the peaceful transfer of power. When a candidate loses an election, they concede. And if they are an incumbent, they leave office gracefully right after they attend the inauguration of their opponent. And in 2020, Donald Trump subscribed to none of these principles. And essentially, the organization of the insurrection and the promulgation of the big lie was based upon denying what had been heretofore commonly accepted procedures. So we don't know yet whether or not our system of government can withstand this kind of stress. And it's very troublesome because, as I mentioned earlier, the National Republican Party doesn't assign hardly any significance to the events of January 6th, 2021. And they are opposed to taking systematic action to investigate what happened and what might be done about it. So there are a lot of stressors in the system right now. And as the president mentioned this morning in his speech, it's very important that the public become active and energized with regard to the 2022 elections and participate in order to reestablish these basic truths and the assumptions that underlie them.
Well, with that, I think that's a good place to wrap up. And I appreciate you for taking the time to speak with us and our audience today. And thank you for everyone who tuned in. We have some coverage today of some of the political implications of the January 6th riot. So go to MLive.com and check out some of that. Again, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate having you on and getting to experience some of your expertise here.
Good to be with you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.